So when we decided to do a worship series on food and kind of decided the metaphors and everything like that, I knew we were going to have to do one on desserts because how do you not do that? And the challenge for me, as I've shared with you before, I've spent over 20 years now diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. So dessert is an interesting thing in my life, right? It definitely had a function growing up that was pretty basic, which was like, give it all to me, as much as you can. And then the relationship with this idea of dessert had to change. And really, whenever it came to the idea of, having dessert at any particular meal or any particular time, it basically came down to a math equation, right? Because I knew that eating that was going to cost me something. Right. And we all know that to some degree, that, eating too much dessert is always going to cost us something. But when you have diabetes and you're checking your blood sugar regularly, you will be informed relatively quickly what it is costing you by the number that shows up on your meter far higher than you want to see it. And so it does come down to this idea. It's a trade-off. It's math, right? It's just like, is this going to be worth it? But that, of course, begs the question. It's like, well, is it ever worth it, right? I mean, because here's the thing about dessert is you don't actually need it. So far we've talked about appetizers, and really the purpose of an appetizer in its purest form is if you come to the meal and you're really, really hungry coming in, it's basically there to kind of tide you over. And so we talked about that when we talked about that from the manna from heaven, right? That wasn't the full promise. It was just there to tide them over until they got to the main course. And so that's the purpose of the appetizer. So it actually has a function for you. You're not supposed to fill up completely on it. And you're not, and it's just there. And if you don't need it because you're not super hungry, then you can kind of skip it and it's okay. But it's like a little preview for what's coming. And of course, the main course is where we live. Right? That world in which we live, it's the thing that sustains us day to day. Hopefully there's a vegetable in there, right? I mean, you really do kind of hope. I mean, you at least got to serve one to your children, even if they're not going to eat it. But if you're going to, you at least got to try, right? But the main course is the one that you worry about to make sure it's got the right mix of everything that you need. And it's got the protein and the carbohydrates and the vegetable and the fruit and that whole pyramid or plate or whatever it is now. They keep changing it. I don't know. But that's where you try to find the balance, right? You want to make sure you're eating a good balanced meal. And that's usually if you've done any diets or programs or anything like that, that's what they focus on, making sure that that main course is as healthy and as responsible as possible. And then you get to dessert. And by the time you get there, your hope that your needs have been met. By the time you get there, hopefully you've actually eaten your vegetables. Behind you get there, you get to this thing that on the face of it, you don't really need, right? It doesn't necessarily have a purpose as far as sustaining your body goes, because what do we eat for dessert, right? We eat things like this, if we're lucky. Now, was anybody actually able to successfully identify this dessert? Just curious. Yummy. There you go. Yes. Well, this took a little digging to find, actually. But this is the Death by Chocolate dessert that used to be served at a restaurant called Bennigan's. I don't know if they're still around anymore. I don't think they are. But when we lived in Albuquerque, which is where we lived when I was first diagnosed with diabetes, there was a Bennigan's nearby, and it was basically the default option for my wife and I if we couldn't think of somewhere else to eat. And it was a place that we would oftentimes go with our friends. And I do remember once going with a small group of our friends to go out to dinner on some random Friday night because we didn't have anything to do and none of us had children, so you could actually go out and do things. Love you guys. And so we go and we eat the meal, and it had not been a particularly wonderful week. It had been challenging, and there had been things going on, and and all that. It hadn't been a particularly bad week, but it hadn't been a particularly good week either. And I was just kind of feeling low, and I wasn't feeling very good. And so we get through the meal, and yes, I ate my vegetable. And then the server comes around and asks the question that they always ask, which is, did you save room for dessert? And everyone kind of looks at each other. And first of all, if you think about that question, it's kind of an odd question, right? Because everything we just got done eating is the things we're supposed to eat, right? The stuff that's good for us. And so I love this question of, did you go forego something good for you so that you could put something in your body that very much is not? But that is the question they always ask. Did you save room for dessert? And people go around the table, and a couple people order things, and then get to me, and I very quietly kind of look over at the waitress, and I said, I'll have the death by chocolate. And she's like, sounds good, sir. And I don't think that my wife or anybody else heard me do this. And we're sitting there, and I'm sitting between my wife on one side, and then on the other side is our friend Marie. Now, Marie is the only other person at that time that I knew that also had diabetes. And she had type 1, and she's dealt with it from when she was a kid. But when I was first diagnosed, we would compare notes a lot. And she was very helpful to me in the beginning and everything. Because quite honestly, your early 20s is pretty early to be diagnosed as a type 2. And so I didn't actually know as many people as I know today who now face the similar condition. And so I realized, though, that I was sitting next to her. And she knew full well, what was going on with me. It'd probably been about a year or two since I'd been diagnosed. I'd been on the phone with her. She talked me through some stuff. And I thought about it for a second, and I'm like, my goodness, I've got my wife on one hand, and I got Marie on the other hand. I am in the middle of like a judgment sandwich, right? They're going to come and put this thing in front of me, and I'm just like, I'm not going to be able to look anywhere next to me. And sure enough, they come and they set all the desserts down, and they set this one in front of me. And my wife just sort of looks at me quizzically, like, really? And I'm like, and then thankfully she set down 2 spoons. And I'm like, for both of us. And then Marie looks over at me, and she looks at the dessert, and then she looks at me, and she looks at me, and she goes, good for you. Sometimes you got to treat yourself. And I'm like, that is not the reaction I was expecting. Here's the thing about desserts. Desserts don't have a function, except they also do. They don't have a function in the way that we want to often think about things, right? It's not about sustaining us. It's not about helping us be healthy. It's not about making sure we have enough vitamins and things like that. But the dessert, properly applied, does provide us something, or can provide us something. And the thing that it can provide us in those moments we need it is joy, right? It is nothing but an indulgence. It exists for no purpose other than to be enjoyed. It serves no purpose other than to end a meal that hopefully was a good experience, a time with friends, maybe a time with family, a time that you enjoyed, a special time. It serves no other purpose but then to extend that time a little further and make sure that the time ends in as nice and as sweet and as joyful a place as possible. That is, at the end of the day, at least in the modern world, I think, the purpose of desserts. Desserts are there to bring joy. And the truth is, if we undervalue something today, it is probably that we undervalue joy. We overvalue being productive. We overvalue what we can put in the world. We overvalue what we can accomplish. We overvalue our bank accounts. We overvalue all those sorts of things that the world tells us we never have enough of. But I think one of the things that we undervalue is we undervalue the importance of making room in our lives for joy. Now, the author of Ecclesiastes, I think, is trying to make this same point in a different way. Now, Ecclesiastes gets a bad rap. And it gets a bad rap if you spend any time in the Bible as being kind of a bummer. Right? I mean, one of the things that if you know anything about Ecclesiastes at all, if you know any of the verses from Ecclesiastes at all, what you probably know are the verses, of which there are several, that say something on the lines of vanity, vanity, everything is vanity, right? It's repeated over and over in the book. You really get this idea that the author, might be a little depressed, right? And likes to continually lift up and recognize that life is sometimes hard, that life sends unexpected hardships into our lives, and that the uncertainty in life that we all have to deal with feels like a daily challenge that is sometimes overwhelming. Ecclesiastes does not run from that reality. And if we're honest, we all know that that is part of human existence. It's been that way from the beginning. It was that way when he was writing. It continues to be that way today. Ecclesiastes is actually a translation of the original Greek that means gatherer or preacher. So the book of Ecclesiastes is probably a sermon or something similar to that existed at the time. And it most likely, even though we have a hard time dating it, because it doesn't really reference anything specific, it doesn't talk about any specific times or places, so we have a hard time dating exactly when it was written. But it was probably written after the Jewish exile, which means that after the Jews were all carried off from the promised land to Babylon, and then some of them returned, that was a very volatile and tumultuous time in the life of God's people. It was very uncertain. Whole lives had been disrupted for decades. They had come back, but the world that they came back to was not the world that they left. They were trying to rebuild. The rebuilding was difficult. They were facing hardships, it felt like, on a constant basis. And it is likely in that world that Ecclesiastes is writing this book into. And instead of running from that reality, instead of running from the idea that, yes, life is hard sometimes and unexpected things happen, he said and chooses to embrace it, and said and chooses to call it out, and said chooses to claim, yes, this is how it is. And so for that reason, I think sometimes the book is kind of, the book is sometimes thought of as actually a rather pessimistic book. I don't agree, and I don't think so. I think he is calling out something important about life that often most of us don't want to deal with. But if you actually go through and read the passages, you will find throughout also passages like the one we read today, where amidst the reality that, yes, life is hard, he also tells us, basically commands us to make sure that amidst the hardness, within all the struggle, that we also make sure that we save some room for joy. And he lifts up joy in that way that we're talking about today. He's like, eat your bread and enjoy it because it is good. Enjoy time with your loved ones because it is joyful and it is good. Make sure that you are saving time in your life, room and space in your life for the good, and not getting so overwhelmed by the bad and the struggle that there's nothing left. To also recognize those moments when God is putting joy into our lives. Because that joy is there for a reason. That joy is as much a part of God's plan for our lives as anything else is. And the challenge that you and I face is the same challenge that they faced 2,000 years ago and 3,000 years ago when the Bible was written, is the uncertainty that comes, the challenges that comes are going to come no matter what. The author's clear about that. Participating in the joy is a choice. Taking advantage and recognizing the joy when it comes into our lives, that we get to choose. We have to choose. We can choose how we choose to eat our bread. We can eat it with lament, or we can recognize that it is good and wonderful and a blessing and nourishing. We can choose how we spend time with our friends and with our family, how we choose to spend time in our lives. We can spend it getting through, or we can accept, we can look for, we can take the opportunity for the fun and the laughter and the joy that comes with those times as well. He's calling us out and saying, make sure that you save room in your lives for joy and take advantage of it when it comes. Now, seminary does a lot of things to you, and it messes up your life in a lot of ways. And one of the ways that actually, it was a very small moment that actually kind of took me off guard into something I've continued to process for a while, was this one time I saw a picture of Jesus that is not like any picture I'd ever seen of Jesus before, and it's this one on the screen. I love this picture of laughing Jesus. If you think about Jesus in your head, and I asked you to pull up a picture of Jesus in your head, I guarantee you the picture you pulled up in your head, he was not laughing. right? I guarantee you that's not what it was. And if you look around your church, around your home, or any depictions you will find about Jesus, he's usually looking at best maybe a little solemn, sometimes rather stern, occasionally even angry. And I'm like, wait a minute, this guy spent 3 years wandering around in the desert, around campfires most night with his best friends. Do we think he did not laugh with them? Do we think that Peter didn't try to tell some jokes? Because if anybody did, it was Peter. Do we think, if we want to believe, and we do believe, and we claim to believe that Jesus came and fully experienced what it is to be human, then surely part of that experience was he experienced laughter and happiness. And that Jesus made room for joy in his life. And if we read the Gospels, we will find little moments where that seems obviously true. The idea that God joins us in our sorrows is very important. But the idea that God joins us in our joy as well, and that God wants that joy in our lives and wants that happiness in our lives, is as important, if not more so. And again, the challenge is that is a choice that we have to choose to see. Because happiness and joy can come into our lives as randomly as anything else can. And as I was thinking about this, I was wondering about those times. And there's no end of times. I mean, I think my hope is, if I asked you, what is that time? Name a time when something interestingly or unexpectedly joyful happened. I mean, hopefully we can all conjure up some of those images. The one that for some reason came into my mind was one from when I was very young. And I must have been in 2nd or 3rd grade because I was still in school in California. And when I was in school in California, we used to do this thing called the walk-a-thon to raise money for something. I have no idea. But you would go around and get sponsors, and then you would walk around the track, and they would sponsor 1 lap around the track, for 10 cents or whatever. So you were incentivized to walk as far as you could, which for me was not very far. And then depending on the amount of money raised, you got so many tickets that went into the raffle. And I never had all that many tickets that went into the raffle. So I never expected to win anything. And so when the time for the raffle comes and they start announcing over the PA, who won what, you can only imagine my surprise when the raffle ticket for 4 tickets to Disneyland came up and my name was called. Now, my sister went to the same school and heard the same announcement that I did. And of course, this happened kind of early in the morning. So then all day, what all my friends asked me, like, well, when are you going to go? How's it going to work? I've never been to Disneyland before at this point. This is all wonderful. And this is before the days of like cell phone and text messaging and all that sort of stuff. So by the time my sister and I get home, we are so unbelievably excited. And because we're children, we don't quite understand that just because you have 4 tickets to get into Disneyland does not mean you have tickets to get to Disneyland. Or a place to stay when you get there. But here is this 6 and 8-year-old incredibly excited about this thing that is going to happen. And to my mother's great credit, within a few months, she actually found a way to make it happen. We were up in the Bay Area, so we traveled down, and we got to go to Disneyland. I don't actually have very many memories of those 3 years that we lived in California. In fact, I have very few. I do remember them calling my name for the tickets. I do remember the trip to Disneyland. And I remember the time the monster truck came to school. But that's a different story. But I remember that trip. And I remember 1980s Disneyland where they still had the sky buckets and the people mover. May they rest in peace. And I remember that trip and hanging out with my family and doing all the rides and having all that fun. So it was very exciting for me when my kids got older that I would eventually be able to take them there as well. And I remember the first time that I got to take my kids to Disneyland, and I grabbed Gavin's hand, and we were there right when it opened, and I grabbed Gavin's hand, and we made a beeline straight to the Pirates of the Caribbean, which is not probably the ride most people run to. But it was the ride that I had the strongest memories of, and there was nothing I wanted more than to have a memory of riding the Pirates of the Caribbean with my kids. And so we got there, we were first in line, we were front in the boat, which means we were going to get splashed when it went down. It was awesome. And so after we got back, I was actually at a leadership team meeting for the church, and it was me and some higher ups from the conference and all these people, and we're sharing about kind of like what's going on in our lives and everything. And I was sharing in that space, oh, I just got back from Disneyland. I got to take my kids on the Pirates of the Caribbean. It was super exciting, and I'm sharing all this wonderful stuff. And one of the people present, a bishop that will remain nameless, looked at me and said, "Oh, that's interesting. I've actually never been to Disneyland." And I'm like, "Oh, I'm sorry." And then she continued with this almost like wispy voice of pride. She's like, because she was from the West Coast, this wispy voice of pride was like, "Yeah, we managed to never take our children there." And I'm like, "Okay." And then she kind of continued on for a little bit about how when she was a kid, she had read this book about how, about Disneyland. And it was supposed to be like this, like, isn't Disneyland so exciting? But the beginning of the book talks about how there were orange groves there before. And she just thought, man, those orange groves sound really nice, and I'm like, okay. And you can see, like, I mean, it was just the idea of this place, and I remember even a couple of years later, we had a follow-up conversation about it. I don't remember why or how it came up, because I certainly didn't bring it up. I think because we had actually taken our kids back a few years later, and she's like, "Yeah, I still don't get that place. I mean, she's like, it's just so fake, it's artificial, blah, 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 blah." And I'm like, okay. I'm like, and of course, this is a bishop, so you say, "Uh-huh," and then you keep your mouth shut. And I was thinking about that as in relationship to this and how to make sense of all that. And I on one hand, I kind of get where she's coming from. And then the other hand, I think, well, it sort of depends on what your priorities are, right? Because Disney is one of those places that exists for a purpose. And it doesn't really exist to educate. It's not like taking your kids to the Smithsonian. It exists for joy, right? The happiest place on earth. It's kind of in the title. And you either kind of buy into that or not. And you do know going in that, yes, this place is not real, but it's not supposed to be, right? It is supposed to be idyllic. It is supposed to be this place where you go that has no purpose other than to, one, take your money. Let's be honest. But in exchange, what does it offer? Well, it offers memories. It offers joy. It offers the opportunity to laugh and have a good time, to put your cares away. It offers you that opportunity to not think about the fact that, yes, the world is chaotic and challenges come out of nowhere, and sometimes life is hard. It offers you kind of an escape from all of that into a place that is about something else, a time and a space that is about something else. A time and a space that's about bringing people together, creating memories amongst families, giving you those places of joy that you can go back to, that you can recall when you need to, pictures that you can look at maybe sometimes when life is hard, and remember that time that you were riding that ride with that person that you liked, or your family that you love, and you can recall the joy you felt in that moment. I have no end of memories from both my time as a child, the time we went to Disneyland, in college with some friends, and of course the couple of times that I've taken my kids and my whole family there. It is a place for us of such deep memory and such deep joy. And it's not necessarily even about the place, right? It's about who we were with and what we were doing and what was going on and the connection between us. And I suppose it could have been there, it could have been somewhere else. But in order to go to Disneyland, that means you actually have to save room in your life and make room in your life for an experience that you hope will be joyful. You actually have to prioritize and invest in a time and opportunity that you hope and expect to be joyful. You have to make room for joy. You have to save room and make sure the rest of life and everything else that's going on and everything else doesn't crowd it all out so that you can have those times and spaces that you need. I think that's what Ecclesiastes is reminding us of. And the reality is, and the truth is, you don't have to go all the way to Disney to make it happen. We are allowed and, in fact, encouraged in our daily lives to make sure we are carving out some time for joy. For those times that to carve out time and prioritize the things we do simply because we like doing them. Spending time with the people we like spending time with simply because we like spending time with them. Doing the puzzle, playing the cards, playing the game, whatever it is, going on the drive, eating the meal, taking the opportunity to say, hey, I'm going to eat dinner and you're going to eat dinner. Do you want to eat dinner together? That may be more fun than doing it apart. There's no real purpose behind that other than it is an opportunity to enjoy the company of somebody that hopefully you like and you care about. God wants us to save room in our lives for joy. God doesn't want us to feel so overwhelmed by everything going on that there isn't any space left. Because it is those times and those moments and that joy that we experience in those places that will sustain us and will get us through all the difficulty and uncertainty that will no doubt come. The thing is, the challenge is that making time for joy is a choice. God is very clear what it is God hopes that we will choose. Amen.